launch in. Thanks, Autumn. So welcome. I'm Christina Buck with Butte County Department of Water and Resource Conservation, the Assistant Director here, and we have Cami Loser, our Director. And we're happy you joined us. Hopefully you have something yummy to eat and are taking a little lunch and advantage of this learning opportunity. We're going to talk about the voluntary agreement process and hear from Thad. Want to let you know that there is an opportunity for questions and answers after his presentation. So a couple ways you can do that. You can raise your hand and then we'll unmute you and invite you to ask your question that way. Or there's a question answer box down at the bottom of Zoom as well, and you can enter your question in writing at that in that window. And just so you know, the panelists and hosts can see your questions when you submit it, and then we'll click it answered, and then it'll be viewable by everybody. So we'll be monitoring both the question answer chat and or you can raise your hand. So those are options. If you're having any technical difficulties, you can email us at bcwater@buttecounty.net, our normal department email. So with that, I want to introduce Thad Bettner, the General Manager of Glen Clusat Irrigation District, and I'll just let you take it away.
All right, you can hear me okay?
Yep, sounds good.
All right, hey, well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining during this lunch hour. I have a 59.5-minute presentation, so that'll leave about 30 seconds for questions, so we should be in good shape. No, just kidding. Hopefully I can breeze through some slides, and I hate hearing myself talk, so I do definitely enjoy more doing the questions and answers. So want to make sure have plenty of time at the end to ask some questions, and then obviously if you can't ask them here, you're feel free to give me a call and be happy to have a one-on-one conversation. So again, thanks for joining. My goal really today is maybe just give a pretty high level overview of the voluntary agreements, what they are. And first, let me just say, it's a terrible name. I've been always trying to think about a better way to describe what's in voluntary agreements. And we're still working on that, but really my goal is to maybe just give a pretty high overview and then maybe dive into some, specific details here and there throughout the presentation. So again, that's really the goal today. So welcome. And just look forward to this next hour. So first, I've got to see if I can get my computer to work. All right. So what I want to cover today is looking at the regulatory backstop or backdrop of the State Water Board process, talking about our voluntary agreement process and why we think this is kind of a new approach. And then really what it means for kind of our healthy rivers, landscapes, community farms in the Sacramento Valley, in the Sacramento Valley watershed. So while I may be talking as the manager at Glen Clusat Irrigation District, there's a lot of other agencies in the Sacramento Valley involved in this process. I don't want to speak on their behalf, but I do want to say that, we are trying to look at a regional approach that we believe benefits the entire Sacramento Valley, in whether you're a farmer, whether you live in a city, whether you love the environment, you fish, et cetera. The goal really is to make sure we're preserving the Sacramento Valley as we now live, work, and enjoy it. So first, just, want to give you just kind of a high level overview of really what's involved when we talk about the voluntary agreements and the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan. And what it really involves is the entire watershed that drains to the Delta, out the Delta into the Pacific Ocean. So, this map shows, going all the way down from where the San Joaquin River flows into the South Delta with some of the east side tributaries that we refer to them as, getting into kind of the middle of the Central Valley with the American and McCollum, and then getting up into our region of the Yuba, Feather, Sacramento rivers. This is really the whole watershed that we're talking about when we look at the Bay Delta. And really what we look at is what parts of the system would be either covered by the Water Quality Control Plan and or voluntary agreements. So it's a huge scale. And obviously a lot of different pieces of the Central Valley are involved in this effort, including us in the Sacramento Valley. So what really is a critical part of this process, and a critical understanding is just the process that involves the State Water Resources Control Board in the regulatory process they go through, and then how basically do we respond, or how do we as water users and you as folks in the community actually get involved or / impacted by that process. So the State Water Resources Control Board, they are an appointed board. They essentially cover the water rights, the water use in the state of California. And specific to the Water Quality Control Plan, what they're responsible for is they essentially develop and update the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan. So the last plan, changed really in about 2006. So it's been a while, and really before that, it was really in the mid-90s where we had kind of a big fundamental change to a new water rights decision that drove a lot of the Delta operations and water uses and water quality requirements. That process also identifies the beneficial uses. So that includes certainly the environment, it includes ag, it includes urban and other uses. So within that context, they look at all the beneficial uses that should be met and need to be met as part of the Water Quality Control Plan. Really, what's critical is it establishes water quality measures to protect those beneficial uses. And really, that protection really involves flow only. So the only knob that they really use to address meeting those benefits is flow only. And obviously, we'll get into a little bit detail why we think that's a concern, or there's better ways to really address the needs of the environment. And it's not just flow. And then lastly, there is a periodic review required. So technically every 3 years, they should be going in and looking at those water quality control plans, updating them and making any changes accordingly. And we haven't seen a periodic review process for over a decade or more. So the water quality control plan development, just kind of a timeline here, is in 2009, they looked at the then 2006 water quality control plan, and then began looking at ways to change it. In 2010, there was a flow criteria workshop and report that was done, and this actually was an outcome of some legislation, state legislation that was passed in 2009, which formed things like the Delta Quality, the Delta Conservancy, the Delta Water Master, things like that. So it was a pretty broad-reaching package of bills that was passed in 2009. But one of the things that it had in it, it also directed the board to develop this flow criteria report. In 2011, they put together a phase 1 scientific basis report. And maybe just to pause there real quick, there's actually 4 phases of the water quality control plan process that they go through. And the first two, phase 1 involves the San Joaquin River tributaries. So that's really what's involved. And if I can go back to the map real quick, just to give you a region. So really what affects the Stanislaus, Tuolumne, and Merced rivers primarily. And so these rivers and the lower San Joaquin River is what would be part of the phase 1 groups of folks. So when we say phase 1, that's the region that's looked at. And so in 2011, there was a scientific basis report completed for phase 1. And essentially what that report is it gives the scientific underpinnings of why they may be looking at a new water quality control plan, the environmental benefits, et cetera, needs and all that. So again, it's a science report that they can base some of their decision on. Then in 2013, they also completed a draft CEQA document. So this process is not exempt from CEQA, so they do have to go through and put together a CEQA document for updating the water quality control plan. So they did that in 2013 for phase 1. And then they're marching through phase 1, and then they also were starting to do phase 2. And so phase 2, again, going back to the map, everybody, involves all of us, essentially north of Sacramento. It includes all the tributaries as well as the Bay Delta itself. And so this would be all of the phase 2 region / party. So a much larger geographic scope, a much larger block of water, and essentially almost a much more complicated system to deal with than the phase 1 folks. So in 2016, for those phase 2 region, they developed a draft scientific basis report, again, similar to what they did for phase 1, but on a different and larger regional scale. And then you can see now they start marching through, the state boards marching through and picking different activities between phase 1 and phase 2. So 2017, they did a revised draft CEQA document for phase 1. 2017, they published a final scientific basis report for phase 2. And then in 2018, they essentially proceeded with the final environmental documentation and the state board adoption of phase 1, where essentially they've set a 40% unimpaired flow approach on the lower San Joaquin tributaries that would have to get met. And now essentially there's a process that moves forward that they try and determine who is responsible or what parties would be responsible for meeting those phase 1 requirements. For us, for phase 2, 2018 was about the time that we actually put the voluntary agreements together to become another alternative to the unimpaired flow approach for the phase 2 process. So this kind of just gives you a graphical situation that summarizes some of those dates. Again, talked about 2009, we talked about phase 1, we've talked about phase 2. Phase 3 is this process where the board, like I was just saying, goes through the assignment of responsibilities for phase 1 and phase 2. They essentially say, based on setting certain water quality control plan requirements, what parties are going to meet those. And so, you go through and you look at your water rights and things like that. So there's a whole lengthy process to go through this assignment. Some of the legal folks will tell you this could take at least 10 years or more. Could be pretty contentious, litigation, et cetera. So this phase, could be the messiest of all the phases if it actually proceeds forward. So, just looking at phase 2, so kind of now I'm just going to really focus on us, our region, and kind of what we're dealing with. And so when you look at the phase 2 process, again, the board went through a process to look at this unimpaired flow approach. And really what that approach says is that a certain amount of inflow into the system needs to flow out of the system. And you look at the unimpaired inflow, and then essentially you can use a portion of that unimpaired inflow for other uses besides just letting it continue to flow out of the system. So the board has looked at potentially for the Sacramento Basin an unimpaired flow of about 55%. And, based on doing some modeling, that would essentially take out over 1 million acre feet of water out of the system or out of our region that's currently being used. And so, that is a significant impact. Ducks Unlimited, when they were looking at this, they kind of did their own work. And we did some as well, but maybe just looking at them kind of as an environmental steward, they did some work and looked at, if this were to be imposed, what would be the potential effects on different crops grown in the Sacramento Valley? It doesn't really look at who or where, it just says, what. And, from their perspective, they looked at particularly a lot of the row crops in annual crops, and estimated that likely over 330,000 acres would be taken out of production in order to meet that unimpaired flow requirement. So a pretty significant impact to the footprint of the Sacramento Valley. And, from a Ducks Unlimited perspective, these crops are what are meeting a lot of the feed requirements for a lot of the birds in the Pacific Flyway, or shorebirds and other things. So, DU had a pretty invested concern about taking particularly these types of crops out of production and the impact to the environment that it would cause. And certainly, we just had a groundwater meeting before this meeting, and actually a lot of these types of crops are providing recharge, incidental recharge and direct recharge into our groundwater basin. So not delivering water to these lands could also cause a pretty significant impact to our groundwater system as well. So really, how do we best improve fish and wildlife? Is our interest, as a district. We do a lot of work in the environment. I mean, we live in it, we work in it, so maintaining it and improving it is important to us. And so how do we continue to meet those fish and wildlife needs while continuing to provide a reliable supply of water to our farms, our ranches, cities, rural communities is vital to us. And just to be blunt, we don't believe a million acre feet leaving the Sacramento Valley is in the best interest for us and you as our neighbors as well. So we really looked at pursuing an alternative approach, and here comes this term voluntary agreement, and really, to me, what it is, it's just an alternative approach to the unimpaired flow that gets us to the same place. So what it really does is it resolves these Bay Delta processes for the next 8 years. It provides an opportunity to advance solutions in an effective, broader way through a single regulatory process, which is what the state board would be doing. And then again, while maintaining just the viability, our environment, the economy of our region. And kind of this figure just kind of talks about, at least from, you want to look at environmental stewardship, river stewardship, really on the right side, what unimpaired flow does is it really takes our current channels, our current rivers. A lot of them are, constructed in a way that the goal is to send water directly out to the ocean and minimize impacts and flooding impacts, et cetera. It doesn't do much in terms of creating new habitat or wetted habitat or suitable habitat in a lot of our river, creeks, and streams. It just takes the water, it puts a little bit on top and continues to send it out. And really what we're trying to do with the voluntary agreement approach, which includes a new flow component, but also includes a lot of restoration, is that we really look at, multi-benefits of more in-stream habitat, spawning habitat, rearing habitat, floodplain habitat, that really we believe is the way you improve all the species, in our valley. I mean, it'll improve the salmonids, the other riverine species. It provides habitats for birds, giant garter snake, shorebirds, et cetera. So we just believe that looking at a flow and habitat approach is much better for the environment while continuing to meet, the other water needs in the valley. So where we are at in the voluntary agreement process, as I mentioned, leaving off on that last kind of calendar of slides, is that in 2018, in December, there was a presentation of the voluntary agreement approach by the state agencies, so by DWR, as well as the Department of Fish and Wildlife. They made a presentation at the State Water Resources Control Board describing what the voluntary agreement process or the contents of the voluntary agreement would be. In 2019, there was a more detailed submittal of the proposal to the state board, again, based on some of the questions that were getting asked. In 2020, we actually put together a detailed framework of what was in the voluntary agreement. 2022, there was MOUs that were signed that advanced the VAs, and then just recently, a couple months ago, the State Water Resources Control Board released a scientific basis report that addressed, the benefits of the voluntary agreement. So I mentioned on the previous calendar slide that the board had done a scientific basis report for phase one. Really now they did a scientific basis report for the voluntary agreement. So essentially there are now two different alternatives to move forward regarding the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan process for us as phase two folks. And likely there would be a CEQA document that would look at those two alternatives that would be coming in the near future. So again, we put together a lot of different materials around noticing this. DWR right now is actually working on a dedicated website that would actually host a lot of the VA proposals and different questions, et cetera, that would be available. So when that's available, we'll certainly send it around to folks. And then in terms of the MOU signatories, there's the Natural Resources Agency, and under that is the Department of Water Resources and California Department of Fish and Wildlife. EPA signed it, and EPA has several different agencies within it. One of them being actually the State Water Resources Control Board. So the EPA did see a lot of benefit in pursuing the voluntary agreement. So it is actually a party in an MOU to this. As mentioned, the two departments within resources, the Bureau of Reclamation, and then a lot of water agencies throughout California signed it as well. So what are the voluntary agreements? So what they do is they implement a portfolio of compensated flows. And I'll talk about the flows here in a little bit on a table. So we go into each essentially tributary, and each one of those tributaries is providing additional flow out of its system by taking different actions. And then it combines with that a bunch of non-flow measures. Essentially, this is habitat, new habitat that would be constructed in the tributaries as well as the delta. And then the other thing is it provides a stable regulatory framework that we can work towards resolving issues again on the San Joaquin River, particularly with the phase one parties. There's the 2019 BIOPS, and that is short for biological opinions. So there were two biological opinions that for both salmon and for smelt in the Delta, and those biological opinions govern the operations of the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project. Those were done in 2019, and actually there is a process right now to update those biological opinions that would happen later this year into next year. There's a 2020 ITP. This is was short for incidental take permit. This is a permit that the Department of Fish and Wildlife gave to the State Water Project to operate its facility in the Delta. And then there's 401 certification. So the State Water Resources Control Board has a process that it goes through to actually certify flows on tributaries that are regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So that's FERC. And so the state board has a process where it has to essentially approve any changes on those streams that may have a FERC regulatory process associated with it. So if that all sounds complicated, don't be surprised, because it is very complicated. And there's a lot of moving pieces there. And again, what we're trying to do with the voluntary agreement process is not have each one of those happen in a vacuum or happen in a way that aren't working together. But again, those processes would get resolved and be to where they work along with the voluntary agreements to provide all these benefits. Some other things that it would provide a new governance structure. So again, the process for making decisions at times can be very challenging. So making sure we have governance that covers that's important. A robust science program, again, that would be developed to where we're taking actions and making sure we have science and monitoring on the ground to understand whether those actions made a difference or not. And if they didn't, how do we learn from mistakes, if you will? So I think we don't have all the right answers. We know that we're going to take actions. They may not work. But again, there's ways to really learn from those types of actions. So making sure that's part of the process. Improving fish and wildlife and reliability for farms. So that's just another kind of underlying or underpinning of moving forward with the VAs. And then a key one is early implementation. I mentioned with the state board process, you go through a phase 1 process, you go through phase 2 process, and then there's this phase 3 where essentially you have to assign all those responsibilities. And I mentioned that could take upwards of 10 years or more with lots of litigation. And in the meantime, nothing's happening. And so really what we're looking at the voluntary agreements would be early implementation, that even as a VA package may be moving forward, are the actions that we could be doing to make new flow available in stream into the Delta, certainly doing restoration projects that we're already doing. So making sure we're not just waiting, but doing things now that will make a difference, because there's really no time to waste at this point. And I didn't want to overlook this in stating these, but I did, just to make sure that these processes are public processes. I know there may be some questions about it, but I know there's things about like, well, this isn't public, or these meetings aren't public, and just want to make sure folks know that all the actions that we'd be doing here would be public, and ensuring that there is a place either as a participant, if somebody actually wants to participate in the voluntary agreements and have a seat at the table, there's opportunities for that, or just wants to be listening to the conversation, there's an opportunity for that. So making sure there's a public process, and participation is going to be vital to all these efforts as well. So maybe just talking about the water piece for a minute. This is a table that talks about the portfolio of new flows that would be added to the system. So, and right now they're listed in kind of by different sets of regions or contractors, but what I just wanted to focus on really was the Sac River Basin. And again, this is the Sacramento, including Mill Deer Creek folks. This is the folks off the Feather, so the Feather River diverters, Yuba, and the American, Bear, and so we've got a lot of folks involved in the SAC system. But this would be the contribution of flows that would happen in different year types. And so you can see, again, just working through those numbers, in a critical year, 39,000 acre feet would be new to the system. A dry year, 278,000 acre feet. Normal, so you can read them here. In a wet, obviously a lot of wet years like this year, you don't really need a lot of new flow to the system to provide benefits. And really, these flows are designed to get to outflow. So these aren't necessarily designed for in-stream flow needs. They're first designed to get to new delta outflows. And then the question is, how do you shape those new delta outflows to provide in-stream benefits, in our neighborhoods? So again, you can see just that in terms of new outflow in these middle type years, we're looking at between 750 and 825,000 acre feet of new delta outflow that would leave essentially the Bay Delta Water Quality Control watershed and flow out to the Pacific Ocean. And just talking about our Sac Basin, just a couple of examples of how that water would be made available. Some entities are looking at reservoir reoperation, essentially drawing their reservoirs down a little bit lower, providing that that water is inflow into a river and flow out the river, to the ocean. Others are looking at land fallowing, actually taking land out of production to make this water available. So our district, for example, along with other settlement contractors, we're looking at taking land out of production, and that would essentially make this water available. So again, that is a very difficult decision. But again, faced with another decision of we could have even more land come out of production if the board were to move forward with unimpaired flow approach, it's a matter of trying to manage risk. So again, kind of our focus really is not that water is we don't believe that while this new water will help, it will not be what makes a difference. It's really going to be how we provide more habitat for the environment and the species. So we're active. I mean, you've probably heard a lot of activities around floodplain reactivation. We spend a lot of time and energy on that. Got just a short summary here. Northern California Water Association has a lot of these documents posted on their website. This is one of them, but particularly you can look and see a lot of the different partners that are working on this effort, but certainly floodplain restoration in the upper Sacramento Valley and lower Sacramento Valley is going to be vital. And so certainly having a committed set of partners, including, NGO folks, is going to be really important to make sure we're getting that work done. We've looked at upwards of 20,000 acres of new floodplain restoration within the Sacramento Valley, a lot of that located within the Sutter Bypass, as being a way to get to some pretty massive landscape changes that would get some of this floodplain work done. Also, we've looked at early implementation projects in the Sac River Basin. So as I mentioned earlier, we're already out doing a lot of work in river, looking at new spawning habitat, new rearing habitat, fish passage, et cetera, to make sure we're getting fish to be in a functional rivering environment. Just adding new flow, as I mentioned earlier, is not going to create new suitable habitat. We actually have to go in there and construct it. So we've been working with partners up and down the Sacramento Valley, to really commit to getting these projects done and doing them now, but also having a whole suite of projects that we continue to do within the 8-year period. So just talking about maybe some governance and decision-making real quick. When we look at kind of the voluntary agreements, one of the things we see is certainly a focus on the Delta and Delta operations, but then we also have us in the tributaries. We are connected both to Delta, and the Delta is connected to us. And so we live in a watershed. And so really we've talked about, in terms of governance, decision-making, and science, et cetera, is really focusing on a system-wide governance. In other words, that whole system needs to function together to make sure if water comes in from upstream tributaries, that's working with actions that may occur in the Delta and vice versa. But the other thing is we also want to make sure that we have the actions that we take on our own tributaries, that we have more of a localized governance for that role, because we have local partners, local interests, local landowners, et cetera. So we want to make sure, as we look at taking actions on our local streams and rivers, that we have our local interests represented as well. And so we've also looked at making sure we have separate governance entities, decision entities on the tributaries as well. So like the Yuba, they have a forum, the American has a forum, and so we've been working one on the Sacramento. So making sure that, again, we have local governance that respects our local bodies, as well as folks and neighbors. So that's really important. And so just a timeline. So kind of, we talked a little bit about, that back schedule. So maybe just this really looks at, well, what happens as we move forward during the next 8 years. So kind of we're in, year, let's say -1 right now, maybe we're looking at year 0. But if voluntary agreements get approved, essentially we're going to start moving, and we want to make sure, 8 years will go quick. So we want to make sure we're pretty diligent in the actions that we're going to take as part of those 8 years. And so the parties in the voluntary agreement, we've really committed to making sure we're meeting specific requirements. So, we would do annual reports. So every year we'd provide a report on what actions were undertaken within the entire voluntary agreement process. So again, habitat that's been created, flows that were provided, monitoring that was done, how do we see species respond? So there'd be annual reports to make sure, there's accountability there. There'd be a triennial report. So the board, is supposed to be doing triennial reports as part of its water quality control plan process. We've just said, well, we'll take on that responsibility of providing those triennial reports as part of the VA process. And then typically, a lot of our salmon are on three-year life cycles, a cohort, if you will. So essentially that would line up well with those triennial reports to also see if you look at the kind of those 3-year life cycle stages of how fish are doing. There'd be a strategic plan. So you could look at the strategic plan and say, here are the actions that are going to be undertaken. And then there'd be governance and science. And so those would be kind of what would be happening through this 8-year process. In year 6, so essentially after the second triennial report, there'd be a look at to kind of say, well, how have the previous 6 years gone? Have we seen improvements? Have we seen issues? How do we correct those? And then essentially in year 8, there would be a decision of, well, where do we go next? The 8-year period is over. We need to do something. What's next? And really there's kind of 3 different pathways. One is to essentially renew those same voluntary agreements. The second one is that the voluntary agreements could be modified, as well as maybe a new update of the Bay Delta plan based on, again, things that have happened during those 8 years, or there could be a termination that they're not working, and then you basically go back to some regulatory pathway or regulatory approach. And so those kind of pathways have been documented in the VA, in the MOU, and be part of any implementation plan going forward in the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan process. So maybe just to kind of do a quick comparison between the two, between voluntary agreements and regulatory approach. Again, just looking at the Sac Valley, there, like I mentioned, there is a dedicated water supply, of at least 250,000 acre feet of new water that would be provided in the middle year types. Again, if the board goes forward with just unimpaired flow approach, there'd be over 1 million acre feet of water every year. So a pretty big difference here that would have to get resolved in some manner. Water management, again, we want to maintain this ridgetop to river mouth type of approach on the actions that we're doing. Again, managing this as a watershed. A regulatory approach would be pretty much chaos. I mean, we're not sure who would be doing what. Likely there'd be a lot of litigation likely. And so just how you actually implement this and the impacts to water management would be unknown. So the structure, again, we'd have this adaptive management, for an 8-year period, and could it get extended up to a 15-year period if VAs continue to move forward. And whereas a regulatory approach would be just one approach, it's unimpaired flow, that's it. And you do it, and there's not a lot of regard to what outcomes would actually happen. Land fallowing, as I mentioned, right now we're looking at up to 35,000 acres that would be fallowed amongst all the water agencies in the Sacramento Valley, so not just us. So we have other agencies that also be fallowing land to make water available. Under the regulatory approach, again, kind of looking at the DU numbers, there'd be over 300,000 acres that would be taken out of production. Dedicated flows. So here we're looking at potentially part of the water that's available would be compensated or purchased and left in stream. Under the regulatory approach, there'd be no money provided. Ecosystem function, again, we would really want to look at this landscape approach supporting the rivers. So a lot of the floodplain restoration, in river habitat, spawning habitat, rearing habitat, whereas the regulatory approach would continue to put new water down the same channel without providing a lot of benefit to species. Funding, we've looked at developing a stable state and federal and water supplier funding portfolio. So a lot of the work that again would be done around habitat restoration, that's all needs to be funded. And so we've looked at essentially charging ourselves to pay for that work. So, for us, this would require another $10 per acre foot on the water we deliver. So pretty significant cost on us. And so again, kind of that's on the next item here, about $5 to $10 an acre foot on diversions. Costs here, obviously, regulatory approach, certainly put litigation, because we expect that, if the unimpaired flow approach would go forward, a lot of folks would disagree with that process and want to take appropriate action. Collaboration, again, we see the VAs being a way to work together going forward. The regulatory approach will basically start to divide, likely, a lot of parties that have historically worked together, which would be unfortunate. And then you can kind of see the others kind of down here again, just in comparison. So again, kind of the path forward as we look at it is really, looking at our seasons and how do we manage our seasons in our watershed to continue to provide the benefits we provide on an annual basis as we've done historically. So, again, spring and summer, how do we use the landscape, a lot of our farming activities, our recreational activities, et cetera. And then as we ship to fall, winter, how do we use our lands and the rivers to continue to provide the environmental benefits they've historically provided here locally and regionally. Again, kind of for us, we see this process as being pretty transformational in its approach. We continue to see this ridgetop to rivermouth multi-benefit water management. I mean, we live and work in a watershed. And, there's also trade-offs and decisions that we make in our watershed. We need to make sure that there's a, conversation that can happen around that's transparent and honest. Certainly we saw last year where water was dedicated out of Shasta for winter run spawning. So basically one species for one life stage, and it basically decimated our part of the Sacramento Valley, our landowners, the environment. We had a lot of the protected species, giant garter snake, Pacific flyway were majorly impacted last year. So we want to make sure as we make decisions in our watershed, a lot of those trade-offs and balances get made in a way that's transparent and folks can participate in. Making sure fish and wildlife, are in harmony with our farming cities and rural communities. Again, a lot of us are already looking at our lands as a working landscape for the environment. So making sure we're managing that in a way that, we can continue to have the lands provide food and fiber, but also provide habitat, and making sure those can coexist together. Science and credibility, we do a lot of work in the science community now, and we want to make sure as we move forward, there's a framework that can happen again, and it can happen in. And again, we think that the VAs are a way to do that that's open and transparent. And then collaboration and partnerships, working with landowners, and hard work. This will take a lot of hard work by a lot of us, and a lot of you if you want to engage. And I think some people just think the unimpaired flow approach is easier because you just take half the water and things magically get better, but it doesn't. I mean, we've seen that a lot of water can be taken and it doesn't make any meaningful difference. So we need to make sure that we're taking actions and we're putting in the work behind it to get it done. And again, it takes a lot of hard work to do that. And just making sure that we have kind of this healthy ecosystem and landscape. Again, this is kind of just a graphic of our watershed, and we want to make sure that we're working, living, and making decisions in that space. And so that's a huge priority for us. And I think that's it. So left some time for questions. And so, yeah, I'd love to take any questions out there, either directly or writing, however you want to do it.
Yeah, thank you, Thad. I know you and others have really lived this for more than 10 years, so it's helpful for us either on the sidelines that have heard about it here and there, or that are just new to the topic, to have a good overview. Thanks for that, and for kind of where the current status is. So we have a couple questions. One, and I'm just going to circle back. Bill had asked a question about the new governance structure, and then you addressed it a little bit after he submitted the question. So Bill, if you have a follow-up to that, if you could go ahead and submit another question if you want more detail than what Thad answered already. So we'll start maybe with Ben King, submitted a question asking, has the Friant contribution been assigned to the Sacramento River?
No, the Friant folks are still providing a block of water. That would be their responsibility. So I've not heard of any shifting of Friant to the Sacramento Valley. But I can follow up with Ben, or if he wants to give me a call to talk more about that, I'd be interested to hear kind of where he may be hearing that from.
Great. Okay. And then I'll just remind folks, if you want to raise your hand, you can ask a question that way with the little hand raise, or you can, write your question in the question and we'll get to it that way. Okay, so Jim Brobeck is asking, the February 22nd issue of the Sacramento Valley Mirror reported that the district's newly elected president, Amero, stated, quote, the district is going to depend more and more on groundwater, end quote. How much Tuscan groundwater will GCID growers use to supplement surface water under the VA program? Yeah, can you talk a little bit about how groundwater is being talked about in this process at all?
Yeah, there have been some folks that have been looking at a way to use groundwater to meet a VA contribution. I think those are primarily on some of the lower feather areas. We haven't really talked about that specifically because we've mentioned really focusing on land idling at this point is the primary way to meet our voluntary agreement contribution. That being said, I mean, any action we take, both for doing the environmental work and for making water available to the environment through the VA processes, we'd have to go through a whole, environmental review process ourselves. So even though we're providing water to the environment for the benefit of the environment, we still have to do an environmental document process to cover it. And I think in there you'd be able to see, likely who and how that water would be provided.
Great, yeah. Okay, so Ashley is asking the number of rice acres that would be fallowed due to the implementation of the BDWQCP was startling. Would you mind explaining a little bit more about how you got that number? Additionally, do you think any of that rice acreage fallowing would be offset by the new incentive programs that are being implemented through the Central Valley Joint Venture, the Rice Commission and others?
I mean, I don't know if she was talking, let me see. I'm sorry if this is too challenging to be doing interactively, but I don't know if she was referring to the Ducks Unlimited evaluation of the rice acres that would be taken out of production.
Or the water quality control plan?
Oh, the water, yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think probably this is go back to this slide, I think.
Yeah.
So again, if you looked at the over 1 million acre feet that the unimpaired flow approach would result in if it were implemented, this would potentially be the crop mix that water would come from. I mean, it's until you really do it, you don't know. But again, this is one approach to look at it. So yeah, I mean, right now, essentially 144,000 acres, which is over 25% of the rice, would be come out of the Sacramento Valley to make this water available. So, which is pretty much unacceptable. So I think that's why we continue to look at the VA as an alternative. We've said that, for us, if we were to implement voluntary agreements through the land fallowing, we've estimated, I had on this other chart, approximately 30 to 35,000 acres would have to be fallowed here to essentially come up with a share of the water. Again, there's reservoir reoperation and other activities that would get to the 250,000 acre feet. And we
Yes.
have kind of, but
Oh, go ahead.
I would say, so each river is kind of put together its own proposal, which has a lot of these numbers documented. This is kind of all wrapped up. So kind of, maybe this is the 30,000 foot level, and, we could dive into the 5,000 foot level at some point if folks were interested.
So along those lines, you mentioned that the state, might centralize things onto a website. Right now, kind of, what's the best spot to go, or is there one to dig into some of the documents that have come out of this process?
Not really. The State Water Resources Control Board has put together a webpage where they put some of it up there, but it's not great to use either. So, I mean, I'd say we've been kind of waiting for DWR to be getting it up and putting all the documents up there.
Okay, maybe when that happens, it'd be good to let us know. We'll make sure to
we could
circulate that around.
Version 2 of this, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Okay, good. Let's see. So Pat Valines has a question about kind of the timing. When will the voluntary agreements be approved? What's the timeline? And I'll just add to that. You talked about the 8 years. Are we in year 0, or is that yet to be determined?
Yeah. So the process right now is let me go back to the timeline slide here. So so right now, as I mentioned, the board put out its scientific basis report for the voluntary agreements a couple months ago. We expect them to evaluate sort of the whole VA program and likely put out some sort of a draft CEQA document, which could be coming out in the next 3 to 4 to 5 months. And then we're likely looking at sometime next year that they would actually wrap up their process and decide, do they want to select the unimpaired flow approach, or do they want to select a VA approach? Essentially, we see those as alternatives. So they would go through their process and select an alternative. So if they approved, VAs next year, then, as I mentioned, we'd likely have to wait till they complete their effort. Then we would do our own environmental effort, our own CEQA process to actually, for the actions we're undertaking, both on some of the restoration projects as well as providing the flow, we'd have to do our own CEQA work, environmental review process. And then once that's approved, then we could actually move forward with implementing the voluntary agreements. And then I would say, yeah, that's when we're year 0, Christina.
Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. So right now it's in the hands of State Board.
Right. Yeah. We've pretty much got everything that they've asked for to do their internal process. We've provided to them.
Okay. That's helpful. Yeah. Okay, here's another specific question from Ben King. Can you describe how flows from the Colusa Trough are accounted for in the required contribution amounts? Or maybe you had mentioned that each tributary has kind of taken a more detailed approach.
Yeah.
Where that information is available?
Yeah, so we have those proposals. I mean, I would say we're not intending to do anything that would change the current natural flow. I mean, I don't know. I think if Ben is asking about the Colusa Trough as maybe water that runs into the system from, the Colusa, the basin drainage area. We're not looking to change, amend, or anything that flow that already occurs. Essentially, this would be new flow that would come into the system. And for us, for example, we would take land out of production. That would mean our diversions or demands would decrease accordingly. And essentially that water would get stored behind Shasta Reservoir for an environmental use. Same thing would happen on the Feather. Some of those agencies would do some fallowing. And so that water wouldn't be delivered and it would stay behind Lake Orville. And then that becomes a block of water that can be made available to the environment. And so it would be up to the governance to structure, including agencies and NGOs and, the fishery agencies, decide how best to use that water, both for in-stream benefits and delta outflow benefits. And ideally, you're using that same block of water to provide multiple benefits. You know, we don't want to see water released for an in-stream benefit and then it doesn't provide a delta benefit or vice versa. So making sure we're maximizing the use and efficiency of that water, if you will, is going to be pretty important. And so essentially this water kind of would ride on top of that. And again, we wouldn't be changing some of the natural flows that would occur like during the wintertime from some of the drainages.
Great. All right, that's our last question at this point. We'll give folks another minute, but thanks again for participating. This is one of our brown bag webinars that our department's doing every other month or so. And the Water Commission meets on those even months for this year. And so they'll be meeting next week on Wednesday in the Board of Supervisors chambers at 1:30 for folks. If you're interested in tracking other water issues in Butte County, they'll be having a discussion about recharge and also getting some updates on some important discussions that are happening in the Vina subbasin with the Vina GSA and in the Wyandotte Creek subbasin with the Wyandotte Creek GSA regarding funding and long-term funding for those GSAs to implement the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act locally. So we welcome you there. And we will also in the future revisit this topic at the Water Commission as well, and maybe hear from someone from the Feather River side of things to get a little bit more detailed look at kind of that tributary specifically. So you can stay tuned for that too. And otherwise, we will be posting, this was recorded, so we have a brown bag webinar page on our website, so we'll post it. And if folks didn't get a chance to be here with us today, you can let your friends and neighbors know that they can catch it online. Am I forgetting anything, Cami?
Sorry, I was just going to add that you mentioned how we are doing this kind of every other month, that our next one in May is for forecast informed reservoir operations, and we'll have someone from the Yuba Water Agency speaking about that because Lake Oroville is a pilot project within that program. So that will be coming in May on May 3rd. So
awesome. Yeah, great. So some thank yous in the question answer box to you, Thad. Thanks again for taking the time and walking through this good content. We will post the slides as well with the recording. So follow up with that if you have questions. He offered that at the beginning, or with our department, and we can point you in the right direction if you want to follow up on anything further. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, Thad.
Thanks.
Thanks
Right,
for taking the time.
You bet. Anytime. Thanks.
Yep,
Bye.
appreciate it. Bye.